Good afternoon. My name is Bob Kendrick, and I'm the chair of the music department here at the University of Chicago. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our very own distinguished alumni lecture, Professor Jeffrey Kallberg from the University of Pennsylvania, a place where actually I was an undergraduate, so I can testify to the quality of the music department that Jeff is currently heading up. Jeff is perhaps one of the most humble of the wonderful scholars of 19th century music I've ever met. And so he will be completely embarrassed, I'm afraid, by the things I'm going to say about him. But I thought it was really necessary to do that simply because, besides the fact that, I need to, I'll be paid back later for this, but simply because this Convocation is really an occasion not only for us to celebrate the alums, the students who, after all, are what we're all about here at the university, but also to celebrate the kinds of innovative, iconoclastic, and really cutting-edge research and composition that we try to do in this department as we try to do across the university as a whole. And simply going through the kinds of things that Jeff has done as a kind of case study of the kinds of knowledge that we're very, very happy seeing coming out of our department and out of our university, I think sort of helps, as well as I think giving a bigger context for the really interesting issues that have come up around the work and the life of Frédéric Chopin, the more so as we're going into a Chopin anniversary year next year in 2010, and we can expect to be bombarded with things wonderful and perhaps routine as we go through the course of the year. Jeff came here in 1976, am I right that? And began his work really in a kind of intellectual genealogy of people who at that time were taking the radical step of pushing on work on composer source materials, the ways that composers thought about their pieces, the relationship of different stages of work and the different kinds of materials we had for those pieces, to the evolution and really to the sort of, if you will, musical thought of composers. And Jeff came into the field at the moment that a number of people, including one of his main teachers, Phil Gossett, who can't be with us here today, were taking the, at that time, radical step of pushing this kind of inquiry into the 19th century. Previously, it had been something that we'd associated with the works of Bach and Mozart and even the sort of locus classicus Beethoven, but to do so in terms of composers whose work and whose lives and thought we knew better was really rather a novel idea. In the course of his work, which culminated in his dissertation and then which Jeff has continued to push on in the years after he completed his dissertation and went on to Penn, where he's now the, as I say, professor and chair of the department, Jeff began to realize a number of things, and I want to sort of recount this from my own perspective as a graduate student reading his work, as I was doing about 20 years ago, as it was coming out and would eventually take shape in the chapters of his book, Chopin, at the Boundaries. What struck me as a graduate student reading Jeff's work was, first of all, his realization that not only were the sources for Chopin's music, the things that we had, the sketches, the corrected proof copies, simply reflective of an extremely complex process, and that process was not only personal and individual and musical, but also social, both in terms of the kinds of markets, publics, audiences that Chopin sought to appeal to, as well as the kinds of constrictions and opportunities that his music publishers, both in France as well as in England and Germany, gave him, but also constricted him to. But also in terms of some of the concepts of that we would take really, that perhaps were best first explained in literary studies, that we could apply to the seemingly abstract instrumental music of Chopin. Concepts of literary genre, concepts, if you will, of the kinds of social resonance, the kinds of social meanings of those genres, and the ways in which those genres also, if you will, coincided, interacted with social categories. I think of some of the chapters of Jeff's book in this context. I think of the ways, for instance, in which his work on the sources, but also the kinds of formal structure that those sources reflect in the Chopin nocturnes, had to do with the social categories of gender in early 19th century Paris, nocturnes as feminine, if not female, genres, and the ways in which those cultural conceptions of female and male had interplay with the real relationships of transmission, power, and the like in such places where gender really was an issue, like the Parisian salons that hosted much of Chopin's work. Similarly, the idea that Chopin's works were artistic creations, to be sure, but also things that had to be sold and transmitted and propagated in a market, led Jeff to some really interesting considerations of Chopin's interactions with his music publishers. The ways in which different forms, versions of works were formatted, sold, trafficked around, and reshaped for publishers, I think was really kind of a new step forward in our understanding of the production of this music as a kind of social phenomenon. Finally, the interaction, and especially true in Chopin's case, as you're all looking up at the piano, between Chopin the virtuoso performer and, if you will, Chopin the virtuoso composer, the ways in which notated music and its written forms, its written, if you will, epiphenomena, had to do, in some cases, with a process of improvisation, but also with a kind of process, if you will, of compositional improvisation. These kinds of things, which over the last 10 or 15 years of Chopin studies have become absolutely on the center stage of work on Chopin and 19th century piano music as a whole, are really due to the fact that Jeff simply introduced them based on his incredible knowledge of the sources and his deep thinking about the ways that these issues get played out in the various forms and formats of Chopin's work. I want to conclude very, very briefly with what will really embarrass Jeff a good deal, and that is just a couple of personal accounts of him, because we produce knowledge here, we write books, we write articles, we write pieces, but we also produce people, and we produce people who are going to train other people who are going to produce knowledge. That's part of what we're about as well. I think that some of the skills that Jeff learned here, in addition to his own native-born talents, were very, very evident to me on a couple of different occasions that I had simply occasion to interact with him. And I remember being an extremely intense, sort of overheated graduate student myself when, I think it was 1992 or 1993, I gave a paper at the Middle Atlantic chapter of the Society for Ethnomusicology, which, despite my 15 years of attempting to repress the memory of this paper, I do recall its title being Heinrich Schenker as ethnomusicologist. It was an effort to sort of deal with German intellectual history in the early 20th century. And although I have sort of repressed most of the details of this paper for good reason, I do remember making the claim that Schenker, on one hand, the great Austro-German music theorist, and Erich von Hornbostel, the great Austrian, really the first, one of the first major ethnomusicologists, students of world music, were in some ways, as I considered them to be, kind of oppositions, but that I was absolutely sure in my graduate student incarnation that I had discovered a higher dialectical synthesis of the two, and was happy to tell everyone in the room about this at great length. Jeff, who was chairing my session, patiently sat through all 25 minutes of this, and with remarkable tact and restraint, and with a little bit of, I think, exertion in archaeology, did manage to unearth the 2 or 3 interesting sentences that I said, having something to do, I think, with German social theory of the late 19th century, and asked friendly, critical, but provocative questions about them, and, as I say, tactfully skipped over the rest of my remarks. I learned a lot from Jeff on that occasion about how to deal with papers like mine when I myself would run into them being presented by graduate students in this department or elsewhere. Finally, I learned a lot from Jeff about 10 years later. We were together on a meeting, a committee that would determine the program of our National Professional Society, the American Musicological Society. Jeff had been the chair the year before, I would be the chair the year after, and I was sort of learning the ropes. What most impressed me about Jeff on that occasion is that in the best Chicago tradition, he argued passionately for his views of what would be and wouldn't be good papers. But I think that he also knew that meetings like that, professional societies, are also social formations in process, and that if other people on the committee, no matter how ignorant we were of the topic at hand, showed great or interest or thought that things would be a good addition to a conference program, he knew enough also to step back and to realize that that was simply an indication that wider parts of a society, of our community of scholars, would indeed be interested in such a paper. So I learned a lot from Jeff about how to do that kind of thing, and then I had to put it into practice myself the very next year. So on a lot of topics and a lot of ways, I'm very, very grateful to Jeff. And I think it's totally appropriate that in a university which is so committed to shaking things up, that we should be able to host him back here as a distinguished alum on a composer who, in the words of the first sentence of his book, Chopin unsettles us. If we're beginning to realize the ways in which Chopin does that, I think it's really due in large part to the work of Jeff, and it's a pleasure to welcome him back and to let him talk to us about Chopin's pencil.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Bob, and thank you for having me as a guest here. It's been a wonderful time yesterday and today, and it's a pleasure to be able to share some of my thoughts, recent thoughts about Chopin. I suppose in some ways what the context I would want to put this, and I'll just say it very briefly, is that I'm trying to think about biography and what biography of a composer might mean in this day and age. So with that, let me just plunge in. Next year marks the 200th anniversary of Chopin's birth, and if you fancy a pilgrimage to his homeland, a must-stop is Chopin's museum in Warsaw. Its treasures include a remarkable and ever-growing assortment of autographed materials, musical manuscripts, letters, notes. It stores collections of editions Chopin used in lessons with his pupils, sometimes annotated by him for the benefit of his high-born students. It owns and displays Chopin's last Pleyel piano, a beautiful instrument, somewhat melancholy to behold since it's now unplayable. In the realm of non-musical objects, it proudly gathers materials related to his life, portraits, clippings of his hair. Actually, there are quite a few of those, strangely. And expensive objects that the composer collected over the course of his storied life, such as a pocket watch that the singer Angelica Catalani gave him in 1828, and a vase that presented to him by King Louis Philippe in 1839, after he and Ignaz Moscheles played a concert at Saint-Cloud. And since 1994, the Chopin Museum has owned and proudly displayed Chopin's pencil. Now, given the splendor of everything else that resides in the Chopin Museum, the inclusion and focus on a little pencil might seem perverse. But I hope to show that this rare artifact associated with Chopin's everyday life does more than project an innocent charm. If we probe a bit, it tells an interesting story, one that productively juxtaposes Chopin's biography with his musical practices. It's a story largely about time, about the fleeting impressions, about the capture of fleeting impressions in life and in music, and about time's passing. We need first to establish, in the way of musicologists, we need to establish a few basic facts about this little implement. Its provenance goes back only a half century. The pianist Adam Harashevich donated the pencil to the museum in 1994. That's when it came into their collection. And he, in turn, received it as a gift from the English Chopin scholar Arthur Hedley in 1957. And there the recorded trail stops. I should mention in passing that. So it's conceivable, although 57 was too early for this, but the University of Chicago almost bought the rest of Hedley's collection in 1969. They were sort of, he wanted a little bit more than what we wanted to pay, evidently. He wanted $100,000 for manuscripts that are worth now probably in the order of $10, $12 million. And it ended up going to Mallorca, where it's very hard to see, actually, the rest of it there, because they're not nice people there. But anyway, apart from that, but we can make an educated guess about the previous history of the pencil. Hedley purchased portions of his collection of Chopiniana from the heirs of Princess Marcelina Czartoryska, who was one of Chopin's pupils and close associates. The princess could have obtained the pencil directly from Chopin, or from among the composer's effects after his death, and then it could have been passed down through successive generations of her family. This is only a guess. We cannot precisely know the truth about the origins of this pencil. Does not matter very much for my story. Looking at the pencil, it certainly seems a familiar, almost ordinary sort of object. Today we might expect to find something that looked like it attached to a pocket calendar or lying in a box next to the scorecards at a golf course. For that's roughly how big it is. It's about 3 inches long. It's, when you project something on the screen, you think it's enormous, but it's, just a little tiny thing. Even the name on the pencil would be familiar to drafters and artists, L and C Hartmut, having evolved into the modern-day Koh-i-Noor Hartmut firm with its business centered in the Czech Republic. And I went to my local art store and picked one up just to sort of amuse myself, and it does still say Hartmut on it. And actually, it's the kind without the eraser, kind of just like Chopin's. They didn't have the little ones, though. I was disappointed. Hartmut, if you're interested in the history of the pencil, you're going to hear a little bit about that today. The Hartmut firm was actually most famous in the history of pencil, second most famous. I'll tell you the first most in a moment. But later history, they were the first ones to invent yellow pencils. So, yeah. So the Hartmut name begins to help us locate Chopin's pencil historically. L and C Ludwig und Karl Hartmut took over the family business in 1816 following the death of their father, one of the most famous people in the history of the pencil. Who knew that his pencil had a history, right? Around 1790, Joseph Hartmut invented a technique for combining clay and graphite into a material that could be molded into pencil lead. He also figured out that changing the ratio of clay to graphite permitted variations in the hardness of the lead. So number 1, he gave them numbers. Hence the number 2 there was, it's like you used to take your tests, or maybe still take your tests with filling in the circles, right, with number 2 pencils. It was Joseph Hartmut who figured that out. These discoveries allowed more durable pencils to be factory produced in greater quantities and for lower prices than had previously been possible. Factory-made pencils allowed the pencil to succeed widely as a writing implement, which means that when Chopin acquired his pencil, it was already an omnipresent and ordinary item for consumers, even though it represented a relatively new technology. That is to say, pencils as a common-day writing implement were pretty much a creature of the 19th century. They existed earlier, but they were things that were harder to create and were more expensive. So how did Chopin use his pencil? Passing mentions of his pencils in his correspondence and in remarks by his associates give us a pretty good idea, and I'm actually going to give you all of them. There aren't that many, so don't worry. From a remark by the mother of his then fiancée, and from a later note he wrote to George Sand, we learn that pencils were necessary for a particular form of household entertainment. So Teresa Wojcinska. But we older ones, myself, Maria, and Teresia, spend lonely days in this castle where the clock seems to strike the hours louder than ever, reminding us that it is time to eat or go to bed. Without a piano or pencils, books, etc., we have nothing to occupy ourselves with. Speaking of pencils, Teresia sends one of her drawings with her best compliments. And then Chopin to George Sand. We dined well yesterday at Madame Marliani's, after which some went off to a soirée, others to their pencils, and others still to bed. So drawing was a favorite pastime, amateur pastime in the 19th century, and as the letters make clear, an activity practiced in groups as well as individually. Chopin himself joined in these goings-on. Sometimes he drew country scenes, but more commonly he sketched characters. Characters. Hello? Yes. Like this jolly corpulent chap with enormous lips and nose, or this hiker with a prominent chin. Though simple and simply amusing, these rapid sketches shared in the contemporary fascination with caricature, which drew on a repertory of stock figures, or in the word of the time, types, type in French, or type in Polish as well. Residents of Chopin's Paris could scarcely escape these types. They animated the professional caricatures by such famous artists as Honoré Daumier that flourished during the July monarchy in such mass-market journals as Le Charivari. They recurred as a constant theme of Balzac's Comédie Humaine, and they served as the points of departure for the descriptive physiologies of professions and trades that flooded the popular press. These types and these caricatures served as filters for basic human encounters, and they informed the science of man in its anthropological and medical guises. Classifying people according to types, even through caricatures, revealed something essential about them. That Chopin turned to the pencil to capture them tells us something about the way this writing implement figured into his life. To capture the apparent truth of a type through exaggeration or excess required a technology of immediacy. Today, when we see an arresting sight, we snap photos with our cell phones. Chopin made rapid sketches with his pencil. That Chopin more generally viewed the pencil as appropriate to fleeting and hasty modes of communication emerges from two closely related letters to Solange Clessanger, Georges Sand's daughter. The first of them. Please write me a word in pencil in one of your stray moments. I will be less long in responding, having got through my influenza and concert. Not the swine flu, as far as we know. And the second one. I was waiting below for the Abyssinian, who was Edward Combe, the diplomat, when Madame, your mother, came down at the same time with him and with great interest asked me questions about your health. I replied to him that you yourself had written me a couple words in pencil the day after the birth of your child, that you had suffered much, but that the sight of your baby girl had made you forget it all. A nervous Chopin wrote to a fraught Solange. Estranged from her mother through a complicated series of events that also caused Sand to break up with Chopin, Solange turned to Chopin for moral and fiscal support in the final stage of her first pregnancy, a stage that overlapped with the outbreak of 1848 revolution in France. Chopin sent his first note the day after his last Parisian concert, the last in his life, and 6 days before the barricades went up for the revolution. As the fates would have it, he wrote his second note, which touchingly records the final meeting of Sand, and I get chills every time I read, Madame, your mother. This is how he referred to Georges Sand, this woman who he had spent 9 years of his life with. There was no Aurore. He never called her George, of course, but no Aurore, no, not even Madame, which was how he generally said, but Madame, your mother. I mean, it's the formality of that. As the fates would have it, he wrote his second note, which touchingly records the final meeting of Sand and Chopin, the day before Solange's baby died suddenly. In this charged atmosphere, only communication by pencil seemed possible. Whereas ordinary written discourse, including the letters that Chopin wrote to Solange, required the measured deliberation of dipping a quill or steel pen in ink, the circumstances in which Solange found herself called for another kind of communication, limited to the most essential words necessary to convey the basic facts of existence: suffering, birth, joy. This association of pencils with heightened emotion, conveyed in its most elemental form, helps explain another role for them signaled in Chopin's correspondence. Pencils functioned as keepsakes, as domestic reminders of separated loved ones. So this is Maria Wodzinska writing to Chopin, his fiancée at the time. When you were getting into the coach, you left the pencil for your portfolio on the piano. You must have been very inconvenienced without it on the road. We are securing it here respectfully, as with relics. The translation doesn't tell you. It's a rather strange letter. That the first sentence and the part after the dash are written in French, and the part in the middle is written in Polish. She, of course, was Polish, and why she was writing him in French. There was something of a distancing thing that was going on here. She writes him as vous, and they're about to be broken up by her mother, basically, and that's, you can sort of see the linguistic signs of it happening. Another letter, this time Chopin to his sister, Ludwika, who had just visited him in Paris and gone back to Warsaw. There are more reminders of you in my own room. On the table is your embroidery for that slipper, wrapped in English tissue paper, and on the piano is that small little pencil, which was in your case, which serves me perfectly. So the Polish is ołóweczek mały. For the only time in his correspondence, Chopin used both the adjective small and a diminutive form of pencil, and it is clear he thereby described a pencil like ours. If it is not literally our little pencil, it is plain that the implement on display in the Chopin Museum served and still serves precisely the same function for others as did the Ludwika's pencil for Chopin, as a relic. Ludwika's pencil found its way to Chopin's piano. This is not the only evidence of Chopin routinely keeping a pencil at the piano. Chopin's pupil Wilhelm von Lentz tells of a lesson he had with Chopin in which he was playing the C major mazurka, opus 33, number 2. Now, for those who don't know, I should mention that the mazurka is a genre rooted in a triple meter 3/4 dance. So, during the lesson, the famous opera composer Giacomo Meyerbeer entered the studio and let Lentz tell the rest of the story. So, Meyerbeer took a seat. Chopin ordered me, this is Lentz talking now, to continue. That's 2/4 time, said Meyerbeer. Chopin disagreed, ordered me to repeat, loudly beat time on the instrument with the pencil. His eyes were glowing. 2/4, Meyerbeer calmly repeated. Only once did I see Chopin lose his temper, and it was this moment. He was beautiful to see as a faint red colored his pale cheeks. That is 3/4, he said loudly, he who always spoke so gently. In other words, sometimes Chopin used his pencil to try to beat sense into morons. So what, I'll try and recreate what happened here. So this is, by the way, it's small. Yeah, you have to squint. You can sort of pretend you can see it if you're in the back. I couldn't from the back. But anyway, I've given here an image from the amazing collection of Chopin editions that we have in the Regenstein Library, one of the greatest collections of Chopin editions outside of Warsaw. And it's available online, by the way, so you can all kind of peruse these editions on your own. So this is dance in 3/4, and let me play first what Meyerbeer wanted to hear, the dance played straight, as it were. But Chopin taught his pupils how to do rubato. And if you look at the very first note and the third chord and kind of peruse elsewhere, it's very hard to see. You can see that there are accents written on lots of second beats. And when Chopin wrote them in his autograph manuscript, he didn't actually write little accents, he wrote big accents. And we think now that they didn't ever get translated into print, but we think that Chopin meant something different by the big accents than he did from little accents, and that there's a definite kind of stretching of time that was supposed to take place. So it was probably Lentz playing something like this that led Meyerbeer to assert that it was 2/4 instead of 3/4, and you can beat your own pencils if you want. Beating sense also meant beating time. Here the pencil marked time. in the explicitness of the gesture for Meyerbeer, who was too obtuse to fathom Chopin's rubato, we gain a glimpse of a more metaphorical function of the pencil in Chopin's music making, namely the marking of time and its passage. Chopin's pencil was readily available to Chasen because he thought it a necessary tool in his teaching. He penciled many obvious things in his students' music: fingerings, phrase marking, suggestions of other repertory, and a special sign, a kind of crosshatch, to indicate a successfully completed work. He wrote freely in editions of his own music, of course, but also in the music of other composers. Here is an example of Chopin modifying the phrasing of a piece by Friedrich Kalkbrenner, that he in a work by Kalkbrenner that he taught to his pupil in 1834. So up here, you can see there's a pencil mark that changes the phrasing, and there's actually another one down here that's dealing with the left-hand phrasing. Here at the end of a section, he adds a big crescendo and tells the student to play it triple forte, actually. So it was a much louder ending than it starts fortissimo, but Chopin wants a big, loud ending at that point and tells the student to do that. And when he wrote it, you see that's kind of an awkward hand. He seems to have taken his pencil and, come back. And just sort of done like this a lot of times, not writing in proper, fashion with it down on the table, but, at arm's length on the lectern, and so you get a kind of awkward to read hand. This gently turned the tables on Kalkbrenner, with whom Chopin considered studying when he first arrived in Paris, and who intervened in Chopin's music by crossing out in pencil an entire passage in the score of Chopin's E minor concerto. This story outraged Chopin's acquaintances in Warsaw, especially his teacher Elsner, as Chopin's sister wrote to her brother. What vexed him horribly was what he called his audacity and arrogance, proffering a pencil to cross out a passage, having only glanced at the score, having never heard the complete effect of the concerto with orchestra. He says that if he had offered you advice, say that if you're writing a second concerto, you should try to make a shorter allegro, that would have been different. But to order you to cross out what was already written, that he cannot forgive. Audacious and arrogant Kalkbrenner's action might have been, but most pianist composers of the time were not shy about taking their pencils to modify substantially other composers' music, or their own. Chopin frequently penciled revisions into students' printed copies of his music. Let me mention just 3 examples of these kinds of changes. If a pupil struggled with technical issues in one of his pieces, Chopin might offer up a simplified version. We see this in Jane Sterling's copy of the Nocturne, Opus 15, number 1 in F major. And this is the middle section, which has a very rapid right-hand tremolo, not so easy to play. Sterling wasn't the world's best pianist, and so he said, I'll make an easier version for you. I'll take out all the lower notes, and you can kind of see him rewriting it here. And what he does is have her play something that's a lot easier. Instead of 6 alternating, it's just a sixth and a single note, and it sounds pretty good and is quite playable that way. Elsewhere, though, he made a suggestion that drew out a hidden line just before the start of the middle section of the Nocturne in C-sharp minor, Opus 27, number 1, in effect allowing her to craft a very individualized performance of the piece, and with the utmost authority in support. So this is a little hard to see. This is the end of the opening section, and I'll play this for you. But you can see there's a solo section on the left hand, and then there's these little stems that stick up that he's added stems to. It's kind of like a Schenkerian graph, right, that we got going on here. Schenker is never very far from our thoughts. So he's marked this line out for her. So the nocturne that begins like this. I'll jump ahead, but just play the beginning. Okay, and this is toward the end of the section. I'll play it for you the way that Chopin, that the music is printed first, and then the way that he altered it for Sterling. Continues on to that section. So here's the modified version. This nice resolution that he creates there from the link into the fast section that follows. Finally, and perhaps most famously, he wrote in many students' copies of the Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, alternate and expanded versions of the concluding cadenza. Right, so I'm not going to play this for you. So this is him adding. He kind of expands the arpeggio going up, and you have this thing that and he crosses out the end of it, and he writes this alternate version in here, which is actually, as it turns out, easier to play than what he'd written up above. It just takes a second and makes it kind of run down. And he did this. This is the earliest that we know about that he did. It was just discovered a couple years ago, he did virtually the same version of this in a couple other students' copies, but then it did some other expansions of it for other students still. So this was a favorite thing of his to do. As with the special voicing in the previous piece, Chopin's gesture in this nocturne granted to the student a personalized interpretation, no less so for the penciled cadenza, recalling the relatively common custom of improvising ornaments in the genre of the nocturne. The realm occupied by Chopin's pencil when he was teaching was not all that different from the function he signaled in his letters to Solange. Chopin picked up his pencil and urged Solange to do the same when it was a question of immediacy of expression. Just as the pencil might capture fleeting thoughts of a mother-to-be in the anxious days before giving birth, so too could it convey to students the nuances of the moment that enlivened the art of performance. Of course, there's another form of Chopin's music writing to consider, namely that involved with composing. Though it simplifies matters somewhat, we can separate Chopin's musical manuscripts into two basic categories: private documents where he first worked out the ideas of a work on paper, and public documents in which he circulated more finished conceptions of a work. Drawing on modern practices and what we know generally about how pencils have been used in history, and Henry Petrosky's fine history of the pencil draws repeated attention to its use by engineers and artists for the initial phases of design, we might assume that Chopin's pencil appears prominently in his private sketches and seldom in his public manuscripts. Instead, though, the rare instances of Chopin's pencil appearing in any of his manuscripts occur more often in his public manuscripts and seldom in his sketches. When these pencil markings occur, they usually add to or change performing indications notated in ink. Interestingly, though, these annotations occur almost entirely in a special subcategory of public manuscript, namely those where the piano appears as part of an instrumental ensemble. Thus, we find pencil annotations in the autograph manuscripts for the Variations for Piano and Orchestra, Opus 2, on La Ci direm la mano, the Fantasy on Polish Themes for Piano and Orchestra, Opus 13, the Krakowiak for Piano and Orchestra, Opus 14, the Concerto for Piano and Orchestra, Opus 21, the Grand Duo for Piano and Cello, which was a joint composition with Auguste Franchomme, and finally the Sonata for Cello and Piano, Opus 65, in a way a joint composition with Auguste Franchomme also. Here, Chopin's pencil provides evidence that Chopin actively performed from these manuscripts. This was not his normal procedure with the large majority of his autographs for solo piano. These works he usually played from memory. But when he performed with other musicians, he depended upon his manuscript and annotated it to coordinate with the other players. All of this is to say that even in autographed manuscripts intended to record a more permanent vision of a piece, Chopin's pencil maintained its association with the ephemeral and momentary effects of performance. Given this association with fleeting thoughts, the lack of pencil in Chopin's sketches seems a curious state of affairs, both in terms of what seems natural to us. Most composers today cannot imagine sketching in anything but pencil, and in light of what we know from George Sand about the miseries Chopin suffered in trying to wrestle onto paper the ideas that initially came to him at the keyboard. As she wrote, it was a series of efforts, indecision, and impatience to recapture certain details of the theme he had heard. What had come to him all of a piece, he now overanalyzed in his desire to transcribe it, and his regret at not finding it again neat, as he said, threw him into a kind of despair. He would shut himself in his room for days at a time, weeping, pacing, breaking his pens, notice, repeating and changing a measure 100 times, writing it and erasing it with equal frequency, and beginning again the next day with meticulous and desperate perseverance. He would spend 6 weeks on a page only to end up writing it just as he had done in his first outpouring. What does it tell us? That despite Chopin's anxiety to find the proper notations for his musical thoughts, he opted for the most laborious writing technology available to him. So this is a drawing George Sand made of Chopin. The original is now lost, unfortunately, in World War II. But we can see he's got his music paper in front of him. You can barely see the staves, and you can see his double inkwell and his quill with the feather sticking out. He usually used quills, I mean, as far as we can tell. And we actually have among his fancy artifacts one of his double inkwells in fine porcelain. Actually, it seems to be some kind of fine porcelain. Using a pen or quill required him frequently to break away from the actual writing to dip and redip the. Whoops, wrong one. Dip and redip the point in the inkwell to blot the excess ink, and we see signs of this all over Chopin's sketches. You know, when he after he'd finished sketching, he would just use them as blotters for his for the messy pen, and so that's not him crossing things out. These things. That's him dealing with his quill. And to allow the ink to dry without smearing, and sometimes he forgot this stage, and you see big smears in the printed page. With a pencil, he could have bypassed these apparent distractions and concentrated solely on translating his sounding inspirations into musical notation. But Chopin's pencil stood for immediacy of expression, for the nuances of the moment, for the impermanence of performance. Composition, though, implied something more permanent. This is why he chose to sketch in ink and to endure all the anxieties and breaking of pens. Even in the most chaotic and apparently hasty of Chopin's sketches, this was necessary. Ink was necessary. Consider the first version of the Prelude in E-flat minor. This sketch gives the impression of being cast down on paper with some sense of urgency. Its notations of pitch are unusually imprecise, and it appears to aim only at capturing the basic motivic gestures of this short work. Yet still, Chopin felt compelled to render his compositional thoughts in ink, not in pencil. So this is a version of the E-flat minor Prelude that's completely different from the final version that he wrote, and that after some effort, I was finally able to make some sense of and get people to perform. If you want to hear what it sounds like, you can Google my homepage, and there's a link to an MP3 of a recording of it. It's quite bizarre. Given this lifelong commitment to sketching in ink, what then are we to make of the occasional private sketch in which Chopin's pencil does appear? Let me draw your attention to two of these anomalous documents. The first of them is a sketch entirely in pencil that Chopin labeled Doina Valacha, which is to say, a doina from the region of Wallachia in Romania. Judging by the characteristics of the paper on which it's written, Chopin probably wrote this down in the mid-1840s. Listeners today might know this genre, which was adapted by klezmer musicians in the early 20th century. Can we hear the first recorded example? This is Joseph Moskowitz, 1916. second view, but you can imagine that a pencil sketch doesn't transmit so well in microfilm always, but this is what he wrote. So as far as I know, this has never been heard in public. So you get a little world premiere here, if you for what it's worth. It's it's a strange little thing. And he wrote a little etc. sign, so this was to have gone on in some fashion. How can Chopin's pencil help us interpret this idiosyncratic document? If composition demanded ink, then we might assume that Chopin did not view himself as composing this particular draft. Pencil implied performance, but it's hard to imagine Chopin seriously playing this short draft. But Chopin himself might not have been the performer. What if this document contains a transcription by Chopin of a performance of a Wallachian doina? Though we know nothing of the circumstances that might have prompted a transcription, Chopin never traveled to Romania, for one thing, it would offer interesting testimony about his ethnographic interests. Recent scholarship suggests that Chopin's specifically Polish genres, especially his mazurkas and polonaises, did not arise out of a spirit of ethnographic reconstruction, but rather reflect his own construction of an imagined national ideal and sound. This does not mean, though, that his curiosity was not otherwise piqued by various traditional forms of music. By comments in his letters, we know that he admired Arabic chant, was disturbed by the singing of a Native American tribe, and by the evidence of the present sketch, perhaps, we can infer that he spent a little while, at least, pondering the doina. The second example concerns a more familiar piece, Chopin's last published waltz, the A-flat major, Opus 64, number 3. Yes. There we go. Sorry, and my apologies for this. And can we have the next audio example? This is Dino Lipati in 1950. We can start it over. Thank you. The sketch for this waltz is one of Chopin's final sketches for a solo piano piece that he eventually published. It probably dates from 1846, 1847. The majority of this document represents every other one of his sketches by being written in ink, but in a unique departure from his customary practice, the sketch also contains a significant layer written in pencil. Chopin's pencil accounts for much of the chordal accompaniment to the melody. Ordinarily in sketches, he would omit this for being obvious. numerous accidentals and ties, a few melodic variants written above the staves of the original inked version fingerings, and in 2 measures where sections join performing directions, a large accent, a sforzando, and the word sotto voce. So if this is a terrible reproduction, my apologies for it. You can sort of tell on this staff, which is this, sort of partway into the beginning of the waltz, that the color of these accompanimental chords here, and you can see a little bit of them up there and down here, is a lot lighter, and that's the part that's in pencil. When you see the original, it's perfectly clear what's going on. There's no questioning what's what. And the place where the join occurs is down at the bottom here, and there's an accent that's in pencil and a sforzando, and the words sotto voce down there. You can take my word for it. As in every other instance we have examined, the apparently trivial choice of writing implement tells us something important about the person who wielded it. That the pencil layer contains performing indications, otherwise rare in the sketches, could suggest that Chopin actually used the sketch in performance. Exigencies of performance, the need to ensure that he played the correct chords, might also explain why he took the unusual step of writing out obvious accompanimental chords. Normally in his sketches, if something was obvious, he didn't write it down. He would save it for when he was writing out the complete copy for the publisher. So that's what's going on with that. If so, then, the presence of these memory aids might then offer some of the earliest hints we have of changes in Chopin's powers as a performer, an issue that we know troubled him in his last appearances before the public in Paris, England, and Scotland in 1848. In this instance, Chopin's pencil possibly marked the passing of his time as a viable pianist. And Chopin's pencil in this manuscript may mark another significant creative change as well. Clues for this come from the paper on which the sketch appears, especially the second page. If you look closely at the reproduction, you can see that the bifolium, the leaf, has been folded in half twice, once vertically and once horizontally. So there's the vertical fold, and there's the horizontal fold. So folds are not unusual in Chopin's public manuscripts. When he put them in envelopes to mail to publishers, he folded them, though normally just once vertically. They are rare in his private sketches, which he obviously didn't mail to anyone. They were private, right? Now and then we see single vertical folds when he wanted to separate the material on one half of the sketch from that on the other half. And actually we saw that on the prelude sketch. But I know of no other sketch with a double fold. If Chopin himself twice folded the sketch and the folds looked to be original, what could have prompted himself to do so? So this is what it looked like. He would have taken it like this to fold it vertically, and then he would have folded it again. And what would he could have done with it then? He could have put it in his pocket, right? A folded sketch could have easily fit into his capacious pocket. And why does this matter? If Chopin put the sketch in his pocket, presumably it was to work on it away from his piano and his desk, and hence without access to his inkwells and quills. This in turn would have necessitated writing with the only portable implement available to him, his pencil. And there's an interesting parallel here with Beethoven, who in his later years turned to sketching in pencil rather than ink, especially in the so-called pocket sketchbooks on which he drafted significant portions of the late string quartets. Without knowing precisely why Chopin felt the need to begin sketching away from his customary writing studio, I note that at least some of the composition of this waltz took place after he left Georges Sand's summer home in Nohant for the very last time in 1846. The rupture of Chopin, the breakup, didn't take place until June 1847, but well before this time, Chopin recognized his welcome there had run out. Chopin depended on the calm of summers in Nohant, the summer estate, to do his writing. Being deprived of this regular structure may have forced him to seek other composing habits. Chopin's pencil thus heralds another change, this one the heartbreaking story of his final years. Chopin continued to try to compose after publishing this waltz, still sketching in ink, but seeking more often yet to try to capture furtive ideas in pencil. These he wrote down in pencil on whatever paper was to hand, and usually this turned out to be his pocket calendar. The calendars from his last 2 years, 1848 and 1849, contained several brief jottings in pencil, fragments of melodies, simple accompaniments, and basic chordal progressions. But the most arresting scrawl appears at the front of the 1848 calendar. I'm not referring to what appears over here, which is a little melody in B-flat major at the beginnings of one, but rather what he's written on the left side of the page, 3 blank staves drawn in pencil. These staves demand notation, but Chopin could muster none, his pencil thus rendering the very image of the collapse of his powers of invention. A trace of melancholy thus runs through the entire history of Chopin's pencil. Recall the women with whom Chopin exchanged letters that mention pencils. Maria Wodzinska, George Sand, Sand's daughter Solange, his sister Ludwika. All of these women came to figure for Chopin as emblems of different kinds of loss. Loss of love, Wodzinska and Sand. Loss of family, Sand, Solange, Ludwika. Loss of his homeland, Ludwika. Retrospectively, he must have reckoned his experiences with each of them as transitory, resonating in the vapors of memory, much like his recollections of performances. With these women in his teaching studio and on stage, the pencil allowed the capture of the moment. It gave nuance to the present. But moments pass, and Chopin's pencil and the marks that it made stand as relics of lost time. So that's my remarks. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. So we have time for questions if you have questions or comments or complaints. Yes?
In the editions, in the published versions, in final version, do you use the annotation with pencil annotations, or you use only the
pen? Yeah.
Pen, yeah.
The majority of them were in pencil. Some of them are in ink. It isn't exactly clear why he decides to do one over the other. But yeah, the majority of them are in pencil, sort of in the moment, basically. Yes?
Broader question. Do I have it right that Chopin would play Bach or go back to Bach for the source of inspiration or the source of...
Yes.
Can you say a little more about that, please?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Chopin was essentially an 18th century man living in the wrong century. And his entire aesthetic outlook was grounded in 18th century thought and 18th century music. And the composers he admired most were Bach and Mozart. And Bach especially came to represent for him the definition of what logic was in music. And that logic lay in counterpoint and fugue in particular. Fugue is a special species of counterpoint. And he played Bach throughout his life, from when he was a young man, a young boy, up until the very end. We actually have evidence of him writing in pencil in editions of Bach as well, making annotations for students, making changes. Yes, the well-tempered clavier. And there's a study just about to come out by a Swiss scholar, Jean-Jacques Eigeldinger, that's going to investigate these fully for the first time. But he absolutely adored Bach, and his tastes in present-day music kind of stopped. He loved opera, but only up through Bellini, so Italian opera in particular. He actually liked Meyerbeer, despite the argument he got into him with. Up until the argument, he liked Meyerbeer, and then he stopped liking Meyerbeer. But Donizetti was beyond the pale. Verdi he referred to as Merdi, and so he didn't.
I mean, as an amateur, I mean, I just know a bit about Bach, but you think of people think of Chopin as the quintessential romantic composer. Then you tell them that he was really influenced by Bach, and they find it hard to believe.
Right.
I could kind of hear it. I mean, you know, hardly play the piano. But in what sense is he more influenced by Bach than, say, other romantic? How does it manifest itself?
Well, in a few ways. I think particularly in his later works. So from the Mazurkas, Opus 50 to the end of his life, so Opus 50 to 65, you start seeing a lot more overt counterpoint, voices interweaving with one another in the music. And there are So that's, a kind of large-scale thing. There's a moment, there are individual moments that are striking. There's a late nocturne in B major where the melody is, the first time you hear it, it's very simple. So. Right, and then he brings it back, and it turns into a kind of an opera aria that's all decorated with trills. Right, and it's just gone. It's a kind of a very operatic kind of moment, and it finishes with a cadenza, right? So everything comes to a stop. And the cadenza turns out to be by Bach. So, kind of two-part invention. Right, so there's that kind of moment. So there are these places that it really emerges.
I was kind of thinking, say if Chopin had the conceit that composition is from God's mind to my hand or something, and it's dictated by some iron logic, like Bach, maybe you do it in pen then rather than pencil.
Yeah, I probably not. I don't think he.
I mean, how did he address the idea of composition? I mean, where did he address where it came from?
It was inspiration that came from somewhere. His views of God were rather difficult to pin down. Actually, I mean, he believed in the supernatural part of Catholicism, but the religious part seems to have been of no interest to him. For
I
the
would say more platonic, in the sense that it's out there.
Yeah, so it's out there somewhere, and it comes to him suddenly, and it just is there, and he.
And you should do it in pen because it's out there.
You do it in pen because it's permanent.
Yeah,
it's permanent.
If you're discovering it, then it's
Yeah, it could be.
We have time for about one more question or comment.
Okay.
Jeff, I'm wondering if there was, if you know anything about the broader cultural history of the pencil. I'm thinking as a kind of new technology that makes writing, easier, more facile, more portable, more ephemeral. Whether it had there was resistance or objections to it. I'm thinking of objections to the typewriter in the early 20th century, or the word processor today, which many people feel take away the certain authenticity and ethics of writing.
Yeah, there's a brand new book by Dennis Barron called A Better Pencil, which is kind of the cultural history of new writing technologies. He starts with cuneiform tablets, basically. He talks about making his students do exercises with trying to write in cuneiform and what the problems with that. And so pencil. The pencil is the interesting exception in this general history, where the new technology is seen to be bothersome and somehow doing harm to what happens later. So it's an exception because it wasn't seen as being bothersome and affront to our sensibilities. And also, unlike other technologies, it has never quite been supplanted, right? So it's the one that's still present. We don't write on clay tablets. We don't use typewriters anymore, to speak of. We don't use quills, but pencils are still around. So it's a kind of interesting exception that way. It's a nice book, B-A-R-O-N, just out on Oxford University Press. So thank you so much for.